Thanks, Steve. You stole my reference, my Trump reference.
Oh, sorry.
All right, so I am here to talk about tidal flooding in urban environments. I am not a climate scientist. I am not a civil engineer. I am certainly not a hydrodynamic flood modeler. I'm a natural resource economist and urban economist. So I have a lot of pictures with water flowing over the, overtopping the seawalls and flooded streets, and colorful maps with flood extent and depth. But I think my task is to explain why I think economics is important for this area of research, for this topic, right? So it's part of this work is part of a large interdisciplinary project at UC Irvine, sponsored by NSF. There is at the center of every aspect of the project a very sophisticated, high-resolution flood model. And certainly the project is meant in part to support the development of that model, the improvements in it. But more so, the project is for making use of it, communicating flood risk more efficiently to residents and to policymakers, studying people's perceptions of risk and how they compare to what we think they actually are exposed to, and ultimately leveraging this model for sound public policy. So I think for economics, to persuade you at the top here, I can't resist looking at this New York Times Science section article from just 6 days ago. That's the one on top. Perils of climate change could swamp coastal real estate. And it's the latest in a series of articles this fall in the Science section in the Times that have sort of announced, at least in their view, that the predicted effects, the coastal inundation effects of climate change have arrived. And it's been interesting to see, even less than 5 years since Hurricane Sandy, the focus shift from the big one, the 100-year flood, and the risks that areas are exposed to that, to the much more frequent, sometimes even purely maximum high tide driven flooding events, the king tides, what we call sunny day flooding, what we've called nuisance flooding at certain times. But the costs of regular nuisances can really add up, and I think this is a good somewhat shift in the way we talk about the costs of flooding. All right, so real estate, first, is an asset market, and it's one that economists have studied for decades, trying to make inferences about the way households value spatially fixed neighborhood amenities, nuisances, and hazards. Right? Things for which we don't observe values directly, but we believe there are implicit prices wrapped up in people's location choices and in their real estate purchases. That is where the work that we've done on this project has focused, extending that literature and using the results of this flood model to do something that has been a very successful measurement tool in economics for public goods. It's the framework that economics brings and the empirical tools, the statistical tools for the valuation of non-market goods, non-market amenities, nuisances, and hazards. So this is not going to do this literature justice in the time I have, but essentially the idea, the hypothesis is that flood exposure should be priced into asset values. If the market is well functioning and people are reasonably well informed and home buyers are strongly motivated to understand what they're getting, then we should be able to unpack with good data and careful analysis the implicit prices that people are paying or the implicit depression in prices that comes in assets that are exposed to greater risk. These are revealed preferences. I put that in here because it's a good story. The larger project also has other social scientists, and they have a door-to-door survey and even focus groups, which I've never worked in focus groups, but those are stated preferences. It's a straightforward attitude. Go ask people what their perceptions of flood risk are, then show them some maps and talk to them about their understanding of these things, whether this is more informative than the FEMA flood maps, which basically just show you the 100-year floodplain. These preferences here that we measure using analysis of real estate prices, that's real money put down for real assets. And I think this is Orange County, that the main study site. It's Newport Beach. So these poor UCI undergraduates are going door to door and asking, very affluent Orange County residents about their exposure to flood risk, and they got a lot of this. From the stories where they come back that it's a Chinese hoax perpetrated to make us less competitive. But it's one thing to say that to the poor UCI undergraduate. It's another to invest the largest asset in your portfolio right behind a seawall. And we think that discipline should give us something to measure if in fact it's there. All right, so I had some of these. These are my own videos. I'm not going to show them to you because I don't think I have time. But back here on the West Coast, right, the articles in the Times are really about Florida and the Atlantic coast. Back here on the West Coast, we get king tides. These are from exactly a year ago down in La Jolla Shores. And there's lots of labor to squeegee the water away from some hotel rooms along the promenade here. And then this is the boat launch. And after a month of king tides, it actually collapsed that whole end of the street. So there are real costs, even here in this county. But Newport Beach is the study site here for a reason. So it's a very nice place. There's more to say about that. That's Balboa Island. That's Balboa Peninsula, if you're familiar with this area. The story about why this is a flood-prone area really is from this old picture. Balboa Island is a glorified sandbar, and Balboa Peninsula is very, very thin. We now have tens of thousands of people living in the city of Newport Beach on those parts of land. So it does flood. It has a very low seawall. Proposals to raise the seawall are always controversial because people don't want to see it. Water sometimes pours over. Okay, here are the pictures I promised. There's a dude on a stand-up paddleboard in some what I would describe as nuisance flooding, tidal flooding, and here's of course this guy. So it is an issue. It's not Florida. And studying this has sometimes been frustrating that we don't have quite enough flooding to really reliably see all of the time. Our project essentially starts with a big data integration exercise. We have two big data sets. One are the parcel level results of the flood simulations, the flood scenarios run by the civil engineers. And it's high resolution not only because the results are reported at the land parcel level. It's very convenient for somebody who's going to try to match it with tax assessor information. But it's also high resolution that they can run lots of different scenarios, not just the 100-year flood, but smaller and more frequent ones that allow us to put together sort of an index of flood risk for each parcel that is subject to any flooding at all for all of Newport Beach. The integration is the flood scenario data with essentially from the tax assessor and tax recorder's offices of the county, right? Every sale is recorded as public information. Structural characteristics, the age of the home, the size of the parcel. Thanks. All right, so stitching that together by the parcel number, essentially, we have a data set where we're prepared to do some analysis of the characteristics that influence the prices at which these things sell. And this is where it really becomes a tricky problem. And you can see it from this map. And if you were anticipating what I was going to say, you saw it from the first photo of Newport Beach. Coastal bayside property is very, very expensive there, and very expensive in a lot of places. There's a large amenity value of being bayside, of being close to the water, that has to be separated from the effect of flood risk. And that's the tricky identification problem that requires good data and lots of it. And I think in this case we are close, but maybe don't have lots of data. The statistical method, which I'm not going to be able to describe to you in much detail, controls for those structural characteristics, for neighborhood fixed effects, everything that's unobservable about the census block group or census tract. And then at the individual parcel level, correlates home prices with flood risk. The additional control for bayside properties is really what allowed us to possibly separate out these effects and measure the effect of flood risk properly controlled for the other effects. My this is too much for my final 30 seconds, but the results at this stage are if you don't control properly for bayside location or waterside, waterfront, you get very, very large positive effects of flood risk, which is what you'd expect because these are the bayside properties. Once you control for that, you get something close to a 5% depression in prices for every 1 standard deviation in flood risk, which is plausible. It's also, for Newport Beach, gigantic amounts of money. So this is where we are. We're working, some feedback suggested that we were struggling to identify this in some ways and that possibly our standard errors weren't estimated correctly. In other specifications, it is difficult to pick up much of an effect, which is also a possibility, right? If homeowners aren't well informed, or if there are other distortions in the market, then or if there's just not that much flooding for them to be concerned about at this stage. So that's where we are. How did I do? On time. How did I do in general?
Questions for Ed?
Ed, first clarification question. What's your measure of risk? Is it perceived risk or actual risk, measured risk? Meaning of likelihood of flooding.
So it is modeled maximum flood depth. It's a weighted average of modeled maximum flood depth on the parcel from different scenarios.
Okay.
So it's neither actual nor perceived, it's modeled. But we think that if the model is good, then it's very close to actual, right? But perceived is quite different.
Exactly.
And the psychologists who've worked on this project and have gone to the focus groups and the surveys have found some low information residents.
Okay.
And some stubborn ones, as I alluded to. You know, what my discipline says about this is that markets are great aggregators of information. Not every market participant has to be super well informed for market prices to reflect reasonably good information. And that's a hypothesis, right? It's something we should be testing by doing work like this, not assuming.
Okay. All right. Then my next question actually becomes irrelevant now that you explained how you actually operationalize the risk. So I'll let others.
Right.
Ed, the New York Times article said that the rising sea level was going to collapse the real estate market because people were going to abandon their properties.
Right.
What do you say to that?
I don't anticipate it going that way, although if it happens, I'm sure you're going to remember I said that.
Come on, Ed.
So one note I had in here that I didn't mention, markets are forward-looking. Asset markets are forward-looking, right? As information comes in, right? Regular sunny day flooding, nuisance flooding, increasing in nuisanceness, and increasing information from the scientific community that sea level rise is real. That information should be priced into coastal real estate as it comes, not all at once. So the idea that one day people are going to wake up and realize that this is a significant problem and the hazards that they're exposed to are much greater than they thought, that's not typically the way asset markets work.
So it seems like if somebody is going to invest all of that money for seaside property, that pretty good chance it's going to flood. And maybe the reason they deny climate change is because it provides some kind of psychological security for them, in the sense that if they believed in climate change, they would know their property is going to devalue. And this is just a way of hiding it from yourself so you can enjoy the property during the periods of time when it's not flooded.
I think that could be right in some cases, yes. Individual risk perceptions and delusional behavior is usually not what we put into our models in economics, or the latter part anyway. And I go back to the idea that markets are better at this than individuals. A lot of people are are trading assets in different kinds of markets and have no idea what they're doing. But it doesn't mean that the prices don't reflect sort of the future flow of profits or services from it. That might sound like an oblique answer, I imagine.
Ed?
Yeah.
Follow-up question, actually, and follow-up on Stanley's. Implied in your model is causal path, that risk of flooding affects market value. But what Stanley is pointing out, and it is a very real possibility, that it is a two-way street.
I don't think this is one where the left-hand side variable, that flood risk itself is endogenous to price. Is that what you're suggesting? That if the value of an asset rises because of a bubble or something, that changes the flood risk?
No, it changes perception of flood risk.
Why?
There are psychological reasons to believe that my investment, huge as it is,
Yeah.
was prudent, smart, and therefore, for me to believe so is to.
So that one we've addressed, but I don't think that the right-hand side variable of interest is endogenous in this case. That's a harder case to make. Although I'll think about it a little bit more.
So I guess my question is, giving this information and sometimes people's reticence to actually pay for their own flood insurance, how much is this impacting everyone else's insurance rates and also in terms of federal assistance, in terms of providing for flood insurance?
Yeah, so
that's a huge kind of.
I normally don't talk
variable.
about this without talking about insurance, but we have a very short time. So the very rarely do people have private flood insurance. FEMA has the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a federal flood insurance program that cities voluntarily sign up for. The rates that homeowners pay are believed to be heavily subsidized, so it's a good bargain for most people if they're in high-risk areas. So someone's negligence currently doesn't affect the rates at which you can get flood insurance if you're in one of these zones, because it's a federal program without competitive or actuarial rates. It needs to move in that direction, badly needs to, right? If the program needs to be set rates so that it's not hemorrhaging money, which it currently is. People should pay something closer to the expected damages given their conditions.
Thank you.
Okay.